In 138 BC, a caravan departed from the gates of Chang'an, the Chinese capital, destined to change the course of world history. Ahead lay thousands of kilometers of uncharted lands, where sandstorms gave way to mountain passes, and each day could be the last. Envoy Zhang Qian, entrusted with a mission by Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, led 100 men. Their goal seemed impossible: to find the nomadic Yuezhi tribes somewhere in the west and forge an alliance with them against the warlike Xiongnu, who were ravaging China's northern borders. Zhang Qian did not know that his journey would last 13 years. He did not anticipate that 10 of those years would be spent in captivity by the very Xiongnu he sought to protect his homeland from. But he certainly did not imagine that his expedition would mark the beginning of the greatest trade route in human history, one that would connect east and west for 1,500 years. China in that era was a mighty empire where crafts and sciences flourished. In the Yellow River Valley, where the capital Chang'an stood, artisans created silk products unmatched in the known world. The secret of producing this precious fabric was guarded more fiercely than the state treasury. Disclosure of the technology was punishable by death. Silk was valued at its weight in gold, but outside the Celestial Empire, it was known only by hearsay. Emperor Wu ruled from 141 to 87 BC. He was an ambitious ruler, striving to expand the state's borders and secure trade routes. The northern nomads, the Xiongnu, raided Chinese lands, stole livestock, and took captives. The Great Wall of China, built over centuries, could not always stop their cavalry. An ally was needed who would strike the Xiongnu from the west. The choice of Zhang Qian was not accidental. This man possessed a rare combination of qualities: the courage of a warrior, the patience of a diplomat, and the curiosity of a scholar. He was about 40 years old when he accepted this dangerous assignment. Interpreters, merchants, warriors, and servants accompanied him. The caravan carried gifts for unknown rulers: silk fabrics, bronze mirrors, lacquerware. All this was meant to demonstrate the power and wealth of the Chinese Empire. The route lay northwest, through territories controlled by the Xiongnu. The caravan moved cautiously, trying to avoid large nomadic encampments. But after a few weeks, the inevitable happened. A Xiongnu vanguard discovered the Chinese. A short battle ensued, in which Zhang Qian and his companions were taken captive. They were brought before the Chanyu, the supreme leader of the Xiongnu. The Chanyu did not execute the prisoners. On the contrary, he showed Zhang Qian a certain respect, appreciating his dignity and education. The Chinese envoy was allowed to live relatively freely. He was given a woman from a local tribe as a wife, and they had a son. But Zhang Qian could not leave the Xiongnu domain. He remained an honored prisoner, constantly watched. Years passed, but the emperor's envoy did not lose hope of fulfilling his mission. In the 10th year of his captivity, Zhang Qian had an opportunity to escape. Taking advantage of the weakened guard during a major festival, he and a few loyal companions left the nomad camp. The fugitives moved west, towards the mountains, beyond which, according to rumors, lived the Yuezhi. The journey was arduous. They had to cross waterless deserts, climb mountain passes where the air was thin and the cold pierced to the bone. Many of those who had begun the journey from Chang'an had already perished, but Zhang Qian stubbornly pressed forward. Through the Pamir Plateau, later called the Roof of the World, the caravan descended into the Fergana Valley. Here, in the fertile lands between the mountains, prosperous oases were located. The local inhabitants cultivated grapes and bred the famous celestial horses, renowned for their speed and endurance. These lands were far from China, and the people here had never seen silk, nor knew of the existence of the great Eastern Empire. Zhang Qian continued further west and finally reached the territory where the Yuezhi had settled. These nomads, driven from their native steppes by the Xiongnu, had established their state in Bactria, in the territory of modern Afghanistan. But time had changed them. The Yuezhi no longer sought military campaigns. They had settled in their new homeland, engaging in agriculture and trade. The proposal for an alliance against the Xiongnu did not interest them. Months of negotiations yielded no results. Formally, the mission failed, but Zhang Qian gathered invaluable information about the western lands. He visited Bactria, Sogdia, and Parthia. He saw cities with populations in the tens of thousands, bazaars where goods from distant lands were traded. He learned of the existence of Persia, India, and distant lands by the Great Western Sea, as the Chinese called the Mediterranean. The envoy meticulously recorded all these observations. The return journey took several more years. Zhang Qian attempted to return by a southern route through Tibet but was again captured by the Xiongnu. This captivity was not long. Turmoil began in the steppe after the Changyu's death. And in the confusion, Zhang Qian escaped. In 126 BC, he finally reached Chang'an. Of the 100 people who set out on the journey, only 2 returned: Zhang Qian himself and his loyal servant. Emperor Wu received the envoy with honors. Zhang Qian's stories about the western lands amazed the court. The Chinese learned of the existence of wealthy states interested in trade. They learned of valuable goods, glassware, carpets, spices. They learned of the celestial horses of Fergana, which could strengthen the Chinese cavalry. Most importantly, it became clear that a route to the west existed, and that regular trade could be established along it. In 121 BC, the first trading caravan set out from Chang'an. A long string of 2-humped camels carried bales of silk and bronze mirrors. The route lay through the Gansu Corridor, a narrow strip of land between mountains and the Gobi Desert, towards the empire's western borders. Organizing such an enterprise required immense resources and meticulous preparation. Each camel could carry up to 300 kilograms of cargo, but hundreds of animals were needed. The Han Dynasty took control of organizing trade expeditions. Fortified outposts were built along the route where caravans could stop to rest and replenish water supplies. The Great Wall of China extended further west, protecting the trade route from nomad raids. Garrisons guarded key points on the route, ensuring relative safety for merchants. Merchants quickly realized that traveling across all of Asia was too dangerous and long for one person. A system of transit points was formed where goods changed hands. A Chinese merchant would deliver silk to Dunhuang, a city on the empire's border. There, the goods were bought by Sogdian merchants, who carried them further into the oases of Central Asia. From there, other merchants transported the cargo to Parthia or Bactria, and so on, until the silk reached the Mediterranean. The route branched out already in Central Asia. The northern branch skirted the Taklamakan Desert from the north, passing through the oases of Turpan, Karashar, and Kucha. The southern branch followed the southern edge of the desert through Khotan, Yarkent, and Kashgar. Both branches converged at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, from where the route led through the Pamirs. This mountain range presented serious obstacles. Passes lay at altitudes of over 4,000 meters above sea level. Beyond the Pamirs, caravans descended into the Fergana Valley. This region quickly became an important trading center. Local rulers understood the benefits of transit trade and tried to ensure safety and comfort for merchants. Caravanserais, special inns, were built in the cities where merchants could find shelter, feed their animals, and repair their equipment. From Fergana, the route led to Sogdia, a region in the valleys of the Zarafshan and Kashkadaria rivers. Here were the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, which would become the most important centers of the Silk Road. The Sogdians, a local Iranian-speaking people, proved to be born traders. They established trading posts along the entire route from China to the Mediterranean, and developed a system of credit and information exchange. West of Sogdia began Parthia, a powerful state that controlled a significant part of the territory of the former Persian Empire. Parthian kings ruled from the mid-2nd century BC to the early 2nd century AD. They controlled key sections of the trade route and derived enormous income from customs duties. Parthia became an intermediary between East and West, and its rulers carefully guarded this role. From Parthia, goods reached Syria, which in the 1st century BC became part of the Roman Empire. Syrian merchants carried silk and spices further to the cities of the Mediterranean. Rome of that era was experiencing a flourishing period. The Republic was transforming into an empire. The wealth of the nobility grew, and they craved luxury and exoticism. Chinese silk quickly became a symbol of status. Only very wealthy people could afford clothing made of this fabric. The Romans called the Chinese Saris, meaning silk people. Little was known about China itself in Rome. The distance was too great, and intermediary merchants were in no hurry to share information about the sources of their goods. Fantastic notions existed that silk grew on trees or was produced by some amazing insects. The technology of its production remained a secret. Trade was a seasonal affair. Caravans departed in spring when the snow in the mountains melted and the passes opened. In summer, merchants endured the heat in oases. In autumn, the return journey began, until the winter cold made the route impassable. A full journey from Chang'an to the Mediterranean took several years. A merchant who set out on the journey might not return home for decades, or not return at all. Dangers lurked at every step. Sandstorms in the desert could bury an entire caravan. Avalanches and rockfalls occurred in the mountains. Bandits attacked traders in desolate places, and diseases decimated people and animals. Local rulers could detain a caravan on any pretext, demanding additional payment. Despite all the risks, trade flourished. The profits were so great that they justified any expense. Gradually, infrastructure began to form along the route. Inns, wells, and watchtowers were built. Entire settlements appeared whose inhabitants served caravans, repaired equipment, and sold provisions, exchanging exhausted animals for fresh ones. Some of these settlements eventually grew into large cities. The Silk Road became more than just a trade route. Ideas, religions, and technologies spread along it. Buddhist monks from India traveled to China, carrying sacred texts and relics. Chinese scholars went west in search of knowledge. Artists and artisans became acquainted with the techniques of other peoples, creating a unique blend of traditions. By the beginning of our era, the Great Silk Road had transformed into a stable system of trade routes connecting the civilizations of the East and West. The Roman Empire reached its peak of power under Emperor Augustus, who ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD. In China, the Han dynasty continued to strengthen its control over the Western territories. The demand for Eastern goods in the Roman Empire grew every year, ensuring the prosperity of all participants in trade. Silk remained the main commodity moving from east to west. Chinese weavers created fabrics of astonishing beauty. Smooth and shiny, they shimmered in the light with all shades. Roman patricians and matrons were willing to pay exorbitant sums for garments made of Chinese silk. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote in the 1st century AD with indignation that the empire spent enormous sums annually on the purchase of luxury goods, including silk and gold flowing to the east. But trade was not limited to silk. Spices were brought from the east. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, porcelain was brought, which Chinese masters had learned to fire at high temperatures, producing thin, almost transparent items. Lacquer boxes, bronze mirrors, jade jewelry were brought. Each of these goods was highly valued in Western countries. Not only material wealth moved westward, ideas and beliefs traveled with the caravans. Buddhism, which originated in India in the 6th century BC, began to spread to Central Asia and China precisely along the Silk Road routes. Buddhist monks founded monasteries in the oases along the road. These abbeys became centers of education, where sacred texts were kept and novices were trained. Buddhist communities appeared in Kashgar, Khotan, and Kucha. Local rulers, seeing the benefit of monasteries, which also served as caravanserais for merchants, supported the monks and donated funds for the construction of temples. In the Mogao caves near Dunhuang, on the eastern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, Buddhist monks created a unique complex of temples and libraries. Hundreds of caves were carved into the rock and decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from the life of Buddha. Chinese pilgrims traveled to India, the birthplace of Buddhism, to study sacred texts and bring copies back to China. One of the most famous was the monk Xuanzang, who made his journey in the 6th century AD. He covered thousands of kilometers, visited many monasteries and kingdoms in India, and brought back over 600 sacred texts to China. Xuanzang's notes became an invaluable source of information about life in Central and South Asia at that time. From west to east, other goods moved. Roman glass became famous for its quality. Craftsmen learned to blow thin, transparent vessels decorated with colorful patterns. In China, such glass was a rarity, and it was paid for generously. Woolen fabrics dyed with purple, extracted from marine mollusks, were brought. Wine from Mediterranean vineyards was brought. Olive oil, carpets from Persia, gold and silver were universal means of payment, but their physical transportation was dangerous. Gradually, a credit system developed. A merchant in one city received a promissory note that could be exchanged for money in another city. This reduced the risk of robbery and facilitated trade. The Sogdians, who settled along the route, created an extensive network of trading houses that trusted each other and conducted complex financial transactions. Not only merchants and monks traveled along the Silk Road. Artisans sought work in distant lands, bringing with them their techniques and secrets. Glassblowers from Syria trained masters in Persia. Chinese weavers, captured during border conflicts, revealed the secrets of silk production in Central Asia. Each culture borrowed something from its neighbors, creating a unique blend of traditions. Music and musical instruments also traveled along the Silk Road. String instruments such as the pipa, which became popular at court, came from Central Asia to China. Persian melodies sounded in the bazaars of Samarkand, alongside Chinese songs. Dancers from Sogdia performed before emperors in Chang'an, amazing spectators with their exotic movements and colorful costumes. Culinary traditions were enriched through trade. Grapes, peaches, and walnuts arrived in China from Central Asia. The Chinese became acquainted with alfalfa, which they began to cultivate as fodder for horses. In the West, they learned about rice, tea, and ginger. Spices changed the cuisine of the Mediterranean, making it more diverse and sophisticated. Veterinary knowledge and animal breeds spread along the route. The Fergana horses, which so impressed Jiang Qian, were brought to China and crossbred with local breeds. The two-humped Bactrian camels, indispensable for desert crossings, spread throughout Central Asia. Chinese masters learned to cultivate grapevines brought from the West. Medical knowledge also traveled along the Silk Road. Indian doctors brought Ayurveda to China, a traditional system of medicine based on the use of herbs and minerals. Chinese healers shared the secrets of acupuncture and moxibustion. Persian physicians synthesized knowledge from various traditions, creating new treatment methods. Medicinal plants became objects of trade. Ginseng from China, saffron from Persia. Cities grew along the Great Silk Road, destined to become centers of trade and culture. Every major oasis, every fertile valley attracted merchants and artisans. Samarkand, located in the Zarafshan River Valley, became one of the most important cities on the route. Its markets buzzed in dozens of languages. Here, one could meet merchants from China, India, Persia, and Byzantium. The city already existed in the 6th century BC when it was founded by the Sogdians. Its favorable geographical location made Samarkand a natural trading center. Routes from the east and south converged here. The city was surrounded by strong walls, protecting its inhabitants from nomad raids. Inside were caravanserais, where merchants could stay for several days or months, waiting for fellow travelers for the next leg of their journey. Bukhara, located west of Samarkand, was another important Sogdian city. Here were workshops where carpets were woven, leather was processed, and pottery was made. Bukhara merchants were known for their business acumen and honesty. The word of a Bukhara merchant was valued as gold. The city was surrounded by gardens and vineyards, irrigated by a complex system of canals. On the eastern edge of the Taklamakan Desert lay Dunhuang, the last major city before a caravan entered the waterless sands. It was an important transit point where traders replenished water and provisions, hired guides who knew the desert trails. Dunhuang was also a spiritual center. The Mogao Caves became the largest repository of Buddhist texts and images in East Asia. Khotan, an oasis on the southern edge of the Taklamakan, was famous for its jade and carpets. Local artisans created carpets with exquisite patterns, highly valued throughout Asia. Jade was mined in the mountains south of the city, and Khotan jade was considered the best in the world. Chinese emperors purchased this stone for centuries to make seals, jewelry, and ritual objects. Kashgar controlled the western approaches to the Tarim Basin. Here, the northern and southern routes skirting the desert converged. The city was located at the foot of the Pamirs, from where the arduous ascent to the mountain passes began. In Kashgar, merchants rested before a difficult crossing, or conversely, regained their strength after descending from the mountains. The Bazaar of Kashgar was one of the largest in Central Asia. Merv, located in an oasis in modern Turkmenistan, was an important city on the western section of the route. Caravans traveling from Sogdia to Parthia and further into Persia passed through Merv. The city was famous for its libraries and scholars. Mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians worked here. The Merv Observatory was one of the best in the medieval world. Nisibis and Palmyra controlled the approaches to the Mediterranean. Palmyra, located in the Syrian desert, reached its zenith in the 2nd century AD. Queen Zenobia made the city independent of Rome and turned it into a trading power. Palmyra's caravans reached the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. The city was adorned with magnificent temples and colonnades. Palmyra's wealth aroused Rome's envy, and in 272 AD, Emperor Aurelian destroyed the city. Caravanserais were an integral part of the Silk Road infrastructure. These fortified inns were built within a day's travel of each other, typically 4-0, 50 kilometers apart. A typical caravanserai was a square or rectangular building with thick walls and a single gate. Inside was a courtyard where pack animals were housed. Around the perimeter were rooms for merchants, warehouses for goods, a kitchen, and a mosque or temple. Some caravanserais were modest structures where a traveler could only spend the night and feed their animals. Others were luxurious complexes with baths, restaurants, and workshops. Rulers understood that comfortable caravanserais attracted merchants and thus brought income in the form of taxes and duties. Some rulers competed to build the most beautiful and convenient caravanserai in their territory. A special atmosphere developed in the caravanserais. Here, people of different nationalities and faiths met. Chinese merchants interacted with Persian ones. Sogdian traders exchanged news with Indian ones. In the evenings, around the campfire, stories of distant lands were told, travel experiences were shared, and dangers on the road were warned against. These meetings fostered mutual understanding between peoples. The security of trade was the main concern of the rulers of the cities on the Silk Road. Caravans were guarded by armed detachments. In particularly dangerous sections, local rulers provided additional guards for a fee. Bandits caught red-handed were punished severely, often by death, to deter others. In some states, there were laws according to which the ruler was obliged to compensate merchants for losses if they were robbed on his territory. The cities of the Silk Road were multinational and multi-confessional. In Samarkand, alongside Buddhist temples, stood Zoroastrian shrines where fire was worshipped. Later, Christian churches of the Nestorian denomination and mosques appeared. Merchants of different faiths coexisted peacefully, understanding that business was more important than religious differences. This tolerance was forced, but it worked. The architecture of the Silk Road cities reflected a blend of cultures. Chinese pagodas stood alongside Persian domes. Greek columns, a legacy of Alexander the Great's campaigns, adorned temples in Bactria. Sogdian houses with flat roofs and inner courtyards were adapted to the hot climate. Over time, a unique style emerged, incorporating elements of different traditions. The road itself was the main trial for those who dared to journey along the Great Silk Road, the Taklamakan Desert, whose name translates as "you enter and do not come out," inspired fear even in experienced camel drivers. Sand dunes hundreds of meters high stretched to the horizon. During the day, temperatures rose to 50 degrees Celsius. At night they dropped to almost zero. The wind raised sandstorms that turned day into night and could last for days. Guides led caravans from oasis to oasis, trying not to deviate from the proven route. There were almost no landmarks in the desert, and it was easy to get lost. Tales of caravans that lost their way and perished from thirst were passed down from generation to generation. Camels could go without water for up to 10 days, but people needed daily hydration. Wells along the route were few and far between, and their locations were kept secret. Sandstorms were not the only danger of the desert. Travelers spoke of mirages that drove people mad. Visions of cities with green gardens and cool fountains appeared among the dunes. Those who succumbed to temptation and turned off the road, chasing a phantom, rarely returned. Old camel drivers taught newcomers not to trust mirages in the desert and to follow only the guide. Mountain crossings were no less arduous. The Pamirs, the roof of the world, rose to an altitude of over 7,000 meters. The passes through which caravans traveled lay at an altitude of 4,000 to 5,000 meters. At such altitudes, the air is thin, and breathing is difficult. Every step is an effort. People and animals suffered from altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, weakness. Some died, unable to withstand the ascent. In winter, the passes were covered with snow and became impassable. Caravans departed in spring when the snow began to melt and completed the crossing in autumn before the cold set in. In summer, rockfalls occurred in the mountains. Rocks heated by the sun lost their stability and tumbled down. Narrow paths wound along the edges of precipices. One wrong move could cost a person and an animal their lives. Rivers flowing from the mountains also posed a danger. In spring, when the snow melted, they turned into turbulent torrents. There were few bridges, and caravans often crossed by wading. The strong current could sweep people away. Goods got wet and spoiled. Some rivers could only be crossed at certain points where the current was weaker and the bottom firmer. Knowledge of these fords was part of a guide's art. Nomadic tribes inhabiting the steppes and foothills posed a constant threat. Some guarded caravans for a fee, others robbed them. Sometimes the same tribe did both, depending on the circumstances. The rulers of the states along the Silk Road tried to negotiate with the nomads, paying them tribute or granting them the right to trade in cities. When negotiations failed, punitive expeditions were sent. Diseases were another danger of the road. Malaria raged in the marshy lowlands. Dysentery arose from poor water quality. Plague, smallpox, and typhus were transmitted from person to person in the crowded caravanserais. There was little medicine, and medical care was primitive. Many died on the road and were buried by the roadside. Entire cemeteries stretched along some sections of the route. Animals were indispensable companions of caravans. The two-humped Bactrian camel could carry 300 kilograms and travel up to 40 kilometers per day. These animals could go without water for up to 10 days and could feed on the sparse desert vegetation. Camels were hardy but stubborn. Herders knew the character of each animal, could calm a raging camel or make a tired one walk. Horses were used for riding and for carrying more valuable but lighter loads. The Fergana celestial horses were renowned for their speed and endurance. Chinese emperors were willing to pay huge sums for such horses. Entire expeditions were sent to Fergana solely to buy purebred horses. Some military campaigns were waged for control over areas where the best horses were bred. Donkeys and mules were also used in caravans, especially in the mountains, where they were more stable on narrow paths. Yaks, adapted to high altitudes, were indispensable for crossing the Pamirs and Tibet. These animals did not suffer from altitude sickness and could carry loads at altitudes where horses and camels suffocated. The equipment of a caravan required careful preparation. Pack saddles had to distribute the weight evenly to avoid chafing the animal's back. Leather bags and wooden chests protected the goods from dust and moisture. Felt tents served as shelter at rest stops. Each member of the caravan carried a supply of food and water for several days, in case the caravan was delayed en route. Organizing a large caravan was a complex undertaking. It was necessary to hire guides, drivers, and guards. Provisions for people and fodder for animals had to be purchased. Permission had to be obtained from the authorities of the states, through whose territory the route passed. All this cost money, and only wealthy merchants could organize a large caravan. Small traders pooled their resources and shared risks. The 6th century AD marked the peak of the Great Silk Road's prosperity. In China, after a period of turmoil, the Tang dynasty was established, ruling from 618 to 907 AD. Tang emperors pursued an active foreign policy, expanding their control over Central Asia. The capital, Chang'an, became a cosmopolitan city with a population of over 1 million people, inhabited by people from dozens of countries. In the West, the Byzantine Empire succeeded Rome as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 AD, became a new center of trade. Byzantine merchants actively traded with Persia, and through intermediaries, with China. The demand for silk and spices in Byzantium was immense, despite attempts to establish its own silk production. Persia lay between China and Byzantium, ruled by the Sasanian dynasty. The Persian Shahs controlled the central sections of the Silk Road and derived enormous income from trade duties. Persian merchants were skilled intermediaries, fluent in the languages and customs of many peoples. Persian goods, especially carpets and glassware, were highly valued in both the East and the West. During this time, an event occurred that changed the history of sericulture. According to legend, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sent 2 monks to China in the mid-6th century with a secret mission. The monks were to steal silkworm cocoons and bring them to Constantinople. The mission was successful. The monks hid the cocoons in hollow staffs and safely delivered them to Byzantium. There, silkworm breeding began, and Byzantium ceased to depend on Chinese imports. However, Chinese silk was still considered the best. Chinese weavers had perfected their craft for centuries, creating fabrics of incredible fineness and beauty. The patterns on silk reflected the symbolism of Chinese culture: dragons, phoenixes, peonies, clouds. Each color had meaning. Yellow was the color of the emperor, red symbolized joy, white mourning. Only the emperor and his family had the right to wear clothes of certain colors and patterns. The trade in spices also reached its peak. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg were valued so highly that they were called black gold. Spices were used not only in cooking but also in medicine, for making incense, and for embalming. Arab merchants controlled the spice trade from India and Southeast Asia, delivering them to the Mediterranean. Porcelain became another important Chinese export commodity. The technology for producing porcelain was developed in China during the Tang Dynasty. Porcelain items were distinguished by their whiteness, durability, and a special ringing sound when struck. Porcelain vases, bowls, and plates were highly valued throughout the world. Europeans tried for centuries to unravel the secret of Chinese porcelain but failed. Only in the 15th century did Europe learn to produce true porcelain. Cultural exchange during the Golden Age of the Silk Road reached unprecedented levels. Entire quarters of foreigners lived in Chang'an: Sogdians, Persians, Arabs, Indians. Foreign musicians and dancers performed at the imperial court. Buddhist, Nestorian, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Manichaean temples stood side by side. The Tang imperial court was known for its tolerance of different religions. The poetry of the Tang dynasty reached its heights, and many poems of that era mentioned the Silk Road. The poet Li Bai wrote about distant lands, exotic goods, and longing for his homeland. Another great poet, Du Fu, described the hardships of military campaigns on the western borders. Chinese poetry of that era is full of images of caravans, deserts, and faraway lands. Science and technology also spread along the Silk Road. Paper, invented in China in the 2nd century AD, gradually made its way west. The Arabs mastered the technology of papermaking in the 7th century, after capturing Chinese craftsmen at the Battle of Talas in 751 AD. From the Arab world, paper reached Europe, revolutionizing the production and education sectors. The Chinese compass, gunpowder, and printing techniques eventually also came to the West. These inventions changed the world, but their dissemination took centuries. Knowledge was transmitted slowly, often distorted in translation from one language to another. But the very fact that ideas could travel over 1,000 kilometers was revolutionary. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge was exchanged between India, Persia, the Arab world, and China. The Indian decimal system of notation and the concept of zero reached the Arab world, and from there to Europe. Persian and Arab astronomers used data from Chinese observations. This exchange of knowledge accelerated the development of science in all regions. Medical knowledge also circulated along the Silk Road. Chinese acupuncture interested Western doctors. Indian Ayurvedic practices penetrated Persia and China. The Greek medical tradition, founded by Hippocrates and systematized by Galen, was known in the East. Medicinal plants from different regions were used by doctors throughout Asia. In the 6th century, an event occurred that radically changed the political map of the regions along the Silk Road. Islam, a new monotheistic religion preached by the Prophet Muhammad, emerged on the Arabian Peninsula. After the Prophet's death in 632 AD, his followers began a swift conquest of neighboring lands. Within a few decades, the Arabs created a caliphate stretching from Spain to the borders of India. Byzantium and Persia, weakened by long wars with each other, could not withstand the Arab onslaught. The Sasanian-Persian Empire fell in 651 AD. Byzantium lost Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. The Arabs established control over most of the western and central sections of the Silk Road. This did not interrupt trade but changed its character. The Arab caliphs understood the value of trade and patronized merchants. Islam encouraged trade, considering honest exchange of goods a pious deed. Arab merchants quickly mastered the routes of the Silk Road and began active trade with China, India, and Central Asia. Arabic became the language of interethnic communication along most of the trade route. Baghdad, founded in 762 AD by Caliph al-Mansur of the Abbasid dynasty, became the new capital of the caliphate and one of the largest cities in the world. By the 9th century, its population exceeded 500,000 people. Baghdad became a center of science and culture. The House of Wisdom was located here, where scholars translated the works of Greek, Persian, and Indian authors into Arabic. Baghdad merchants traded throughout the known world. Arab geographers compiled detailed descriptions of trade routes. Ibn Khordadbeh wrote a book of Roads and Kingdoms in the 9th century, describing routes from Baghdad to China. These works were not just guides for merchants but valuable sources of geographical knowledge. Arab travelers reached the remotest corners of Asia, bringing back stories of strange countries and peoples. The Islamization of Central Asia occurred gradually. Arab troops captured Samarkand and Bukhara in the early 7th century, but the local population resisted the new religion for a long time. Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and Nestorians continued to practice their faiths. Only by the 10th century did Islam become the dominant religion in the region. This process was accompanied by cultural synthesis. Persian, Turkic, and Arab traditions merged into a unique Central Asian Islamic culture. The Battle of Talas in 751 AD was a turning point. Arab troops defeated the Chinese army in the territory of modern Kazakhstan. This battle determined the spheres of influence. West of the Pamirs, Islam was established. East of it, Chinese influence was preserved. Among the prisoners were Chinese paper-making masters. The Arabs mastered the technology, and soon paper mills appeared in Samarkand, Baghdad, and then throughout the Islamic world. Caravans continued to travel along the Silk Road, but the composition of the merchants changed. Arab and Persian merchants dominated the western sections. The Sogdians, who converted to Islam, retained their role as intermediaries. Chinese merchants still carried silk and porcelain to the west, but now a significant portion of the trade went by sea. Arab ships sailed from the Persian Gulf to India, Southeast Asia, and even reached Chinese ports. The maritime Silk Road gradually became an alternative to the overland route. Sea trade was less dangerous and more profitable. One ship could carry the cargo of hundreds of camels. The ports of Basra, Siraf, and Hormuz on the Persian Gulf became prosperous trading centers. From there, goods went to Aden, then to India, Ceylon, Malacca, and Canton. This route connected the Mediterranean with the Far East. China of the Tang dynasty in the 8th century experienced internal turmoil. The An Lushan Rebellion in 755 to 763 AD shook the empire. Control over the western territories weakened. Tibet and the Uyghurs occupied parts of Central Asia. Trade continued, but it became riskier and less regular. The fall of the Tang dynasty in 907 AD ushered in a period of fragmentation that lasted until the establishment of the Song dynasty in 960 AD. Turkic peoples played an increasingly important role in the history of the Silk Road. The Uyghur Khaganate, which existed from 744 to 847 AD, controlled important sections of trade routes in Central Asia. The Uyghurs adopted Manichaeism, then Buddhism. Their capital, Karabalgasun, became a trading and cultural center. After the fall of the Khaganate, many Uyghurs migrated to the oases of eastern Turkestan, where they established prosperous states. The Karakhanid Khanate, founded in the mid-10th century, united a significant part of Central Asia under the rule of Turkic rulers who had adopted Islam. The capital was Kashgar. The Karakhanids patronized trade and sciences. Outstanding scholars worked under their rule. Yusuf Balasagun wrote a poem about just rule. Mahmud al-Kashgari compiled the first dictionary of Turkic languages. These works became monuments of Turkic culture. Cultural synthesis on the Silk Road reached new heights. In architecture, structures appeared that combined elements of different traditions. Buddhist pagodas were built using Persian architectural techniques. Islamic mosques incorporated elements of Chinese decor. Artisans created items where Chinese motifs intertwined with Arabic calligraphy and Persian ornaments. Music and poetry were enriched by cultural exchange. Persian poetry was influenced by Arabic metrics and Chinese imagery. Musical instruments traveled with the merchants. The Chinese pipa, the Persian tar, and the Arabic oud were heard in various countries. Singers and musicians from Central Asia performed at courts from Baghdad to Chang'an. Science developed through the exchange of knowledge along the Silk Road. Arab scholars synthesized the achievements of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese science. The mathematician al-Khwarizmi, who worked in Baghdad in the 9th century, laid the foundations of algebra, using the Indian system of calculation. The astronomer al-Biruni, who lived at the turn of the 10th and 11th centuries, studied the works of his Indian and Greek colleagues, creating new theories. The 10th century brought upheavals that radically changed the world along the Silk Road. From the steppes of Mongolia, armies led by Genghis Khan emerged, uniting the disparate Mongol tribes. Within a few decades, the Mongols created the largest land empire in history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. The conquests were accompanied by monstrous destruction. Cities were razed to the ground. Populations were exterminated, but paradoxically, Mongol rule led to the revival of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan was born around 1162. By 1206, he had united the Mongol tribes and was proclaimed Great Khan. The Mongol army was invincible, Superior cavalry, iron discipline, and tactical flexibility made the Mongols a formidable force. In 1211 to 1224, the Mongols defeated the Khwarezmian state, which controlled Central Asia. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv were captured and partially destroyed. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire was divided among his descendants, but conquests continued. Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, captured Baghdad in 1258, putting an end to the Abbasid Caliphate. Another grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai, completed the conquest of China, founding the Yuan dynasty, which ruled from 1271 to 1368 AD. For the first time since Zhang Qian's time, the entire Silk Road was under a single authority. The Mongol rulers quickly understood the value of trade. They established strict order on trade routes, severely punishing bandits. They created a system of yam, postal stations, where messengers and merchants could change horses and rest. Uniform laws were enforced throughout the empire, simplifying trade. Merchants received special privileges and patronage from the Khans. The era of Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, began, during which it was possible to travel along the Silk Road relatively safely. Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, became the most famous traveler of this era. In 1271, he set out from Venice to China with his father and uncle. The journey took 3.5 years. Marco Polo spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan, serving the Mongol emperor. He traveled throughout China and neighboring countries, observing their life, customs, and achievements. Upon returning to Venice in 1295, Marco Polo dictated a book about his travels. The Book of Travels described the wealth of the East, the magnificence of Chinese cities, and exotic customs. Many contemporaries did not believe Marco Polo's accounts, considering them fabrications, but the book had a profound impact on Europeans, awakening interest in the East. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus set out to find a sea route to India, inspired by Marco Polo's descriptions. Under Mongol rule, trade reached unprecedented levels. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were exported to the West in large quantities. Persian carpets, Arab perfumes, and European woolens were brought to the East. New goods appeared. Gunpowder, compasses, and printed books began to be exported from China. Technologies spread faster than ever before. Paper money, which the Mongols adopted from the Chinese, was introduced throughout the empire. Cultural exchange under the Mongols reached new heights. Scholars, artists, and artisans from all over the world came to the court of Kublai Khan in Khanbalik, as the Mongols called Beijing. Persian astronomers worked in Chinese observatories. European artisans taught Chinese new techniques. Chinese doctors shared their knowledge with Arab colleagues. This was a period of unprecedented interaction of cultures. The religious tolerance of the Mongols facilitated the spread of ideas. Mongol Khans patronized all religions: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Taoism. Debates were held at court between representatives of different faiths. Christian missionaries, such as the Franciscan Giovanni Dupien del Carpin and William of Rubruck, traveled to Mongolia, hoping to convert the Khans to Christianity. Their reports brought valuable information about the East to Europe. Nestorianism, an eastern branch of Christianity, spread widely along the Silk Road. Nestorian communities existed in Central Asia, China, and Mongolia. Many Mongols, including some members of the Khan's family, adopted Nestorianism. Nestorian churches stood in Khanbalik. But after the fall of the Mongol dynasty in China, Nestorianism quickly declined. Artisans created works reflecting the synthesis of cultures. Persian miniaturists worked in China, adopting Chinese painting techniques. Chinese artists depicted Mongol Khans in the tradition of Persian miniatures. Ceramics, textiles, and metalwork from that era demonstrate an incredible blend of styles. Blue and white Chinese porcelain, which became the hallmark of Chinese ceramics, appeared under the influence of Persian tastes. But the Mongol Empire was short-lived. Even during Kublai Khan's lifetime, disputes began between different branches of the Chingizids: the Golden Horde in the South Russian steppes, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, formally recognized the supremacy of the Great Khan in China but were de facto independent. In the 14th century, these states increasingly waged war against each other. In China, popular discontent with Mongol rule grew. The Mongols remained foreigners, ruling a vast empire through violence and fear. A series of popular uprisings in the mid-14th century weakened the Yuan dynasty. In 1368, the Mongols were expelled from China. The Ming dynasty came to power. The new rulers pursued an isolationist policy, limiting contact with the outside world. In Persia, the Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1340s. In Central Asia, a new conqueror, Timur, also known as Tamerlane, rose to prominence. From 1371, he began to create his empire, conquering Central Asia, Persia, the Caucasus, reaching India and Anatolia. Timur was a ruthless conqueror, but also a patron of arts and sciences. His capital, Samarkand, became one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Timur died in 1405 during a campaign against China. His descendants, the Timurids, ruled Central Asia until the end of the 15th century. Under them, Samarkand, Herat, and Bukhara became centers of science and art. Ulugh Beg's observatory in Samarkand was the best in the world. Persian miniature painting reached unprecedented heights. But the era of prosperous trade along the Silk Road was coming to an end. The 15th century marked the decline of the overland Silk Road. Several factors coincided to put an end to the 1,500-year history of this great trade route. The political fragmentation of Central Asia, where numerous khaganates warred with each other, made travel dangerous. The Chinese Ming dynasty curtailed its active foreign policy and focused on internal affairs. But the biggest blow was the discovery of sea routes to India and China. The Ottoman Empire, which captured Constantinople in 1453, gained control of trade routes between Asia and Europe. The Ottomans levied high duties on goods coming from the east. European merchants sought ways to bypass Ottoman intermediaries. The Portuguese were the first to find a solution. By rounding Africa, they could reach India by sea. Vasco da Gama, in 1497–99, made the first voyage from Europe to India, around Africa. This discovery revolutionized world trade. The sea route was faster, safer, and cheaper than the overland route. One ship carried the cargo of thousands of camels. The Portuguese quickly gained control of the spice trade, establishing a network of factories from Africa to China. The Spaniards took a different path. Christopher Columbus set sail west in 1492, hoping to reach India. Instead, he discovered America. Although Columbus was mistaken, his discovery had enormous consequences. Silver and gold from the New World flooded into Europe, changing the world economy. The process of globalization began, in which the Silk Road had no place. The Ming dynasty in China pursued a policy of self-isolation. After the grand maritime expeditions of Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century, when the Chinese fleet reached Africa, the emperors decided to cease overseas voyages. The construction of ocean-going ships was forbidden. China focused on strengthening its land borders. The Great Wall was rebuilt and expanded. Trade with the outside world was strictly controlled and limited. In Central Asia, wars continued between the successors of Timur, the Uzbek Khans, and the descendants of Genghis Khan. Cities that had once prospered from trade fell into decline. Caravanserais were destroyed, and wells in the deserts were filled in. Merchants preferred safer sea routes. The population of the Silk Road cities decreased. Many artisans lost their orders. The Bukhara and Khiva Khanates in Central Asia, and the Mughal Empire in India, continued to trade along the old routes, but volume steadily declined. Silk was still imported from China, but now by sea. Persian carpets and Indian textiles were also more often sent by ship. Overland trade continued at a regional level, connecting neighboring countries. But the great transit from the Far East to Europe ceased. The discovery of America also changed the very nature of trade. New goods appeared on world markets: tobacco, potatoes, corn, and tomatoes from America. Coffee from Ethiopia, via Arabia, spread throughout the world. Tea from China became a popular drink in Europe. Sugar from Caribbean plantations replaced honey. World trade became truly global, and the Silk Road found itself as a marginal route. European powers created colonial empires. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French divided the world among themselves. Trading companies, such as the British and Dutch East India Companies, controlled trade with Asia. These companies had their own armies and fleets, concluded treaties with local rulers, and effectively governed entire regions. The old trade routes of the Silk Road could not compete with this new system. The cities of the Silk Road gradually lost their significance. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Herat retained their cultural and religious importance, but economically declined. Travelers of the 15th-18th centuries described once magnificent cities as remnants of past glory. Caravanserais stood half-empty, and bazaars lost their former variety of goods. The population decreased. However, the cultural heritage of the Silk Road was preserved. The architectural monuments of Samarkand and Bukhara continued to inspire admiration in the few travelers. Craft traditions were passed down from master to apprentice. Carpet weaving, ceramics, and metalworking in Central Asia and Persia maintained a high level. These products found buyers in local markets and in neighboring regions. Central Asian Islamic culture continued to develop despite economic decline. Madrasas in Bukhara and Samarkand continued to train scholars and theologians. Sufi orders spread the mystical teachings of Islam. Poets and writers created works in Persian and Turkic languages. Musical traditions were preserved and enriched. The China of the Ming dynasty and later the Qing remained relatively isolated from world trade until the 19th century. Europeans conducted limited trade through the port of Canton, but access to the interior was closed. Silk and porcelain were exported by sea. Tea became China's main export commodity, and the British established an entire tea trade system that had enormous economic and political significance. Persia, under the rule of the Safavid dynasty in the 15th-18th centuries, remained an important player in regional trade. Persian merchants traded with India, Central Asia, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. The Shah's court patronized the arts, and Persian carpets, miniatures, and metalwork were highly valued. But Persia no longer held its former significance as an intermediary between East and West. The Russian state began its expansion into Siberia and Central Asia. By the end of the 15th century, Cossack detachments serving the Tsar reached the Pacific Ocean. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire began the conquest of Central Asia, annexing the Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand. This brought some revival of trade in the region, but within the framework of the Russian colonial system, not a revival of the Silk Road. The 19th century brought renewed interest in the Silk Road, but no longer as a trade route, but as an object of historical and archaeological study. European travelers and scholars ventured into Central Asia, driven by scientific curiosity and imperial ambitions. The great game between the British and Russian empires for control of Central Asia spurred exploration of the region. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen first used the term Silk Road in his work on China in 1877. This name stuck and came to denote the entire system of trade routes connecting East and West in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Richthofen's works attracted the attention of the scientific community to the history of transcontinental trade. Archaeological expeditions in the early 20th century made sensational discoveries. The British archaeologist Aurel Stein, of Hungarian origin, made several expeditions to Central Asia and Western China. In the Mogao caves of Dunhuang, he discovered thousands of ancient manuscripts and works of art. These findings shed light on the history of Buddhism, cultural exchange between civilizations, and the daily life of Silk Road cities. The French explorer Paul Pelliot also worked in Dunhuang, taking valuable manuscripts to Paris. German expeditions led by Albert von Lecoq and Albert Grunwedel explored the ruins of cities in the Tarim Basin. Russian scholars studied monuments in the territory of Central Asia, which was part of the Russian Empire. These expeditions collected vast collections of artifacts that are now housed in museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. Archaeological finds confirmed and supplemented the information from written sources. The remains of cities, caravanserais, and fortresses along the Silk Road were discovered. Samples of silk, porcelain, and glass were found, demonstrating the scale of trade. Coins from different countries testified to monetary circulation. Wall paintings in temples and palaces showed a blend of artistic styles. The 20th century brought new upheavals to the region. 2 world wars, political upheavals, and the Cold War changed the political map. The Soviet Union incorporated Central Asia into its territory. The People's Republic of China established control over Xinjiang. Borders were closed, and the region was cut off from the outside world. Scientific research on the Silk Road continued, but on a limited scale. In the second half of the 20th century, interest in the history of the Silk Road revived. UNESCO launched the Integral Study of the Silk Road Project in 1988, aimed at studying and preserving cultural heritage. International expeditions, conferences, and publications contributed to increased knowledge about the Great Trade Route. Many monuments along the route were included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened new opportunities. Central Asian republics gained independence and began to develop tourism, utilizing the heritage of the Silk Road. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva were restored and began to attract tourists from all over the world. China also began to actively promote tourism in Xinjiang, restoring monuments of ancient cities. In the 21st century, the concept of the Silk Road found a new embodiment. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, aims to create modern infrastructure connecting Asia with Europe. Railways, highways, and pipelines are being built to revive trade links along the route of the ancient Silk Road. This is an ambitious project involving dozens of countries. The cultural heritage of the Silk Road is alive in the modern world. The architectural monuments of Samarkand and Bukhara, the Dunhuang Caves, the ruins of ancient fortresses in the deserts of Central Asia, attract researchers and tourists. Craft traditions of carpet weaving, ceramics, and metalworking are preserved by masters in Central Asia, Persia, and China. Music and culinary traditions, shaped by cultural exchange along the Silk Road, remain part of the life of the region's peoples. The study of the Silk Road's history continues. Archaeologists discover new sites, historians find unknown documents, linguists decipher ancient texts. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how this unique system of cultural and trade exchange functioned. It becomes clear that the Silk Road was not just a road for caravans, but a bridge between civilizations. The Great Silk Road left an indelible mark on human history. For 1,500 years, it connected peoples and cultures, fostering the spread of ideas, technologies, and religions. Along this road traveled not only merchants with goods, but also scholars with knowledge, monks with faith, and artists with images. The Silk Road showed that different civilizations can interact for mutual benefit, enriching each other. Cities that grew along the Silk Road became centers of cosmopolitan culture where East and West met. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Kashgar were places where a Chinese merchant could meet a Roman trader, where a Buddhist monk could converse with a Christian missionary, and where a Persian poet could draw inspiration from Chinese painting. This openness and tolerance were forced, dictated by economic necessity, but their influence on culture was immense. The technologies and ideas that spread along the Silk Road changed the world. Paper from China revolutionized production and education in the Islamic world and Europe. The compass and gunpowder, also originating from the East, changed navigation and warfare. Mathematical knowledge that circulated between India, Persia, the Arab world, and China formed the basis of modern science. Religious ideas of Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam spread along the trade routes, shaping the spiritual landscape of the regions. The Silk Road proved that isolation is ruinous for development, while exchange and interaction lead to prosperity. When trade flourished, so did the cities along the route. Crafts and sciences developed, and masterpieces of art were created. When trade routes closed due to wars or political decisions, decline set in. This historical pattern remains relevant in the modern world. The memory of the Great Silk Road is preserved in every city through which caravans passed. In the narrow streets of Bukhara, in the majestic portals of Samarkand's madrasas, in the cave temples of Dunhuang, lives the spirit of that era, when the world was connected by threads of trade and cultural contacts. By studying this history, modern humanity can draw important lessons about the value of dialogue between cultures, about the advantages of cooperation over confrontation, and about how differences enrich rather than divide peoples.